Greetings, YouTube. Over the years, I've read a lot of D&D and Pathfinder magic items. Classes that deal with elemental energy, powers, feats, spells, psionic stuff, you name it. I've probably skimmed it at least once on all the core rules, and in many third-party and supplemental pieces of material. And I've noticed something over the years. It was particularly evident in the environmental books put out in the 3.5 era. And that's this weird thing about what types of elemental magic classes, monsters, and magic items possess when they are themed to a particular climate. What do I mean by that? Well, this is what I mean. That if you're talking about the Frostburn setting, I think it was Frostburn. Was it Frostburn? Yeah, Frostburn. They had Frostburn, and then they had the desert one in here someplace. Sandstorm? Yeah, Sandstorm. When you're dealing with, like, the Frostburn setting, all of the abilities and items and spells and things were geared towards cold magic. And Frostburn is a fantasy Arctic setting. And lots of things in this fantasy Arctic setting had a partial or sometimes even a complete immunity to cold. And sometimes that near or complete immunity to cold came with a weakness to fire. Do you see where I'm going here? Why would you want class features or feats or magic items or spells tuned in a frosty environment to cold energy, or I know energy, cold is not an energy type, but in D&D and Pathfinder, for some weird reason, that's how they frame the narrative, so yes. So why would you want that as a weapon choice when it would make a whole lot more sense to be using fire, which your enemies are not immune to, partially or completely. And in Sandstorm, it's just the opposite. Lots of heat resistance, lots of abilities that deal with heat. There was I think there's a dragon someplace that like fires like hot sand, which is kind of cool. But I gotta tell you, that must be some really dry throat. But the old grain stuck in the teeth and stuff. But a lot of the things in Sandstorm are going to be immune, partially or completely, to heat or fire, because it's a desert, a fantasy desert environment. So it's even more, radical in some places than it is in our world. In our world, deserts can be really incredibly harsh, and the Arctic or the Antarctic can be really incredibly harsh. But since this is a fantasy setting, they just crank it up to 11 in both extremes. So I was always wondering, the writers of this, do they find themselves kind of down the rabbit hole? So they're thinking along this frosty or this fire-based theme, and they have these like creative blinders that don't let them see that it just doesn't make sense. Now, I had a sorcerer I played at one time, and the sorcerer themed everything cold. He had a feat that let him change the energy type of any spell he had to cold. But here's the thing. Every spell he took was not a cold-based spell. So he had he would take acid spells and fire spells and electric spells. I don't think we had sonic spells at that point in the game, or not. I'm not positive. I replaced acid with sonic for earth, because it makes more sense to me. Kind of vibrational thing with quartz crystals, that kind of vibe. Get it? Kind of vibe? I crack me up. At least one of us is. So what would happen is if I needed another energy type, even though thematically the character traditionally cast cold spells because he just converted every spell to cold because of the feat he took, he had those in his repertoire. They were available to him at any time. He just didn't apply that feat, and bingo, fire, electric, acid, anywhere he wants. that gave him a great deal more versatility, while still maintaining under Mars circumstances that theme. And I think the campaign didn't last that long, but eventually he probably would have become known for someone that casts cold spells, so that could then become something that his enemies anticipated, protected themselves from, and when he sees his cold spells not working, drop defeat, boom, nail them with something they aren't expecting. By that same token, if you're in a frosty environment, use fire. If you're in a hot environment, use cold. Your enemies are not conditioned to resist those things, because that is not the environment they evolved from, or evolved their adaptations to, I should say. It would work in this environment too. I mean, if you had that kind of ability to cast some kind of magic using a heat spell against something that's got heavy fur, and it's designed with blubber, that's going to give him a little bit of resistance, maybe, but they're just not prepared for suddenly finding themselves surrounded by heat. And if you blast something at the equator with cold, that's going to have a greater effect than your average person or creature in a temperate environment. In fact, there are some plants and animals from the equator that if you get them too cold, they're going to go into shock. They're going to die. So it would work here. It would work in a fantasy setting. And I've never been able to figure out why writers do this, because I've seen it again and again and again from many different writers and many different publishers through entire versions, multiple versions of D&D and fantasy games. I've seen it again and again and again. So my question is, can any of you explain this to me? Does it make sense to you? Do you think that my ideas of using fire against cold creatures and cold against fire creatures or heat creatures make sense? And have you ever encountered a setting that did apply that very simple piece of logic? Because I haven't. I would love to see if somebody else out there has. That would be spiff. So let's talk about elemental energy enigmas. I do love a bit of good alliteration.